librarian with Shawnee State University, and as a librarian, I am beyond thrilled to see such a crowd for a book, and a book that is so important to Portsmouth and describes a people that have such resilience. And I am almost speechless, and those who know me know that does not happen very often. So I would like to, before I introduce Sam, I would like to thank some people. Shawnee State Library staff, they're an amazing group to work with, and they have supported this project in every way possible. The Dean of Library Services, Bob Trues, who I think it was his second day in the library, and we said, we'd like to bring Sam Quinones to Portsmouth, and he said yes. And I doubt he had any idea what he was getting into, but we appreciate that. Shawnee State Administration and the Development Foundation. The Development Foundation has graciously supported Sam's visit here. I'd also like to thank our administrative assistant in the library, Lori Perry. We could not have kept ourselves organized without her help. And those of you who do organize projects know how critical that is. Another group I'd like to recognize is the alcohol. I have to always look at my notes for that. The Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services Board of Adams, Lawrence, and Scioto counties. This project came about, I was inspired by the work. I serve on that board, and I was inspired by the providers who visit our meetings, and I was inspired by the staff and board members who work so hard to improve addiction and mental health services in our community. And their work inspires me every meeting. Thank them. Now, and I know you want me to introduce Sam, but I have one more special group I would like to recognize. In the front are some reserved seats. In the book Dreamland are many people mentioned from our community. These are the brave souls that opened up their homes to Sam, opened up their hearts to Sam at a time when none of us wanted to talk about it. We all wanted it to pretend. These are the people who fought those pilgrims here. Everyone to give a hand to the individuals in the first 3 rows who are in the book who helped make Dreamland what it is. One final note, and then I will introduce Sam, I promise. The bookstore will be here after, and Sam will be available for a book signing. The bookstore has run out of copies of the book, but you are more than welcome to order a copy, and they can get it in within a day or 2. So they will be here to take orders for the book. Now, what you've been waiting for. Sam Quinones, the author of Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic, is an acclaimed journalist and author. Dreamland has received high praise from many circles. In fact, Dreamland recently won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, a very prestigious award. But most of us in Portsmouth already knew that. We already recognized how important this book was, and we thank Sam for writing it. Sam has led a pretty interesting life. I encourage all of you to read a brief biography on samquinones.com. Mexico, where he wrote this from. for the Los Angeles Times. Now, I can't help but mention a part of his biography that really intrigued me. When Sam was a student at UC Berkeley, he produced punk rock concerts for bands such as the Dead Kennedys. So if we have time, we want to find out about that too. Without further ado, let me introduce Sam Quinones, author of Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. How you guys doing? Good? All right. Well, it is really been looking forward to this day for quite some time in Los Angeles. It's great to be back in the all-American town of Portsmouth, Ohio. It's beautiful. And today, I even got this cool T-shirt, which is from when they were trying to get rid of all those nasty pill mills. They, I guess, printed this up, and now I have one, so I'm very, very happy about that. Thank you, Janet, for all your hard work on this. Has been great. I really, really appreciate it. I've been, as I say, looking forward to this for some time, and I should tell you that when I began this book, I never had actually heard of Portsmouth, Ohio. A guy mentioned it to me, you should, if you're going to write this book, you ought to think about that. I had really started into this project really by writing about Mexican heroin traffickers and why heroin traffickers in Mexico were doing all this great business all of a sudden, right? And that turned into a book because I realized it was nationwide. And as I got into it, people are helping. One guy said, check out Portsmouth, Ohio. Told me that was the capital of the pill mills or some kind of pill mill thing. I really didn't even know what a pill mill was at that point. I was all about heroin at that point, Mexicans and heroin. So I had to look it up on a map, this town. As I was getting into it, I called Lisa Roberts over at the Public Health Department, and she explained the basic idea of what had happened to the town. And she mentioned a doctor by the name of David Proctor. I assume some of you may know him. I always write to people in prison, and he was in prison. So I wrote to him and asked him for an interview. I ordered his licensing records, and I put all this down in a book proposal, believing that I would come to this town like once or maybe twice just to tell that pill mill story because there was a whole bunch of other things going on all over the country, and I knew that these were all part of the story too, and I needed to do this. And then I set out to really write, as I said, a book about Mexican heroin traffickers and their business. And in fact, I found that the Mexican heroin had killed a dozen people from fatal overdoses in Huntington, West Virginia. So at the time I began, I also had questions of how is it there could be such an appetite at all for heroin in Appalachia. I'd grown up in the 70s. I'd seen all those great New York heroin movies, Serpico and French Connection and all those. This earring is from Al Pacino in Serpico. He looks so cool with an earring in his ear. When I was 15, I get beat up if I had an earring in my ear at 15. When I got to Berkeley, I put an earring in my ear. Hey guys, how you doing? And so, excuse me, in late 2012, I signed a contract to write this book that attempted to go way beyond, I thought, the heroin thing and move into the story of how pills and heroin could be all over this country. And in 2013, spring of 2013, I think it was, I came to this town for the first time. I was in a rental car, dinky little rental car, driving down 52, and I'd never really seen a Rust Belt town before in my life. I saw the abandoned buildings, the check cashing places, the fast food. I think I saw a few hookers somewhere, and I thought to myself, "Wow, I've never seen this before in my life." And thought this is an interesting town. I spoke with Ed Hughes. We had a meeting at your Bob Evans out in New Boston out there, which is about the only place I could get cell service, by the way. He told me about how the first signs of how the pills crept into the community right about 1997. I'm a crime reporter, basically. At heart, that's my thing, and I thought this was a drug and crime book. That's how I was approaching this book. It was, though, I realized, if it's about heroin, it's a depressing story. And I realized somewhere, somehow, I needed to find an ending that was hopeful. If I didn't, I wouldn't even want to read the book, you know. My second visit was in the summer of 2013. The first visit, I learned kind of the basic contours of what had happened with the pill mills. And David Proctor, the guy who kind of starts it all, and I came back thinking, I left thinking I had to go some other place. I left thinking, well, maybe next time, I'm going to probably have to come back again next time. I'll get deeper into that story. That's an interesting story. The second time I came was summer of 2013. And really, it just came back to understand more fully that whole pill mill story, and a little bit more about how the town was the way it was, because I had heard that it actually was not always kind of a Rust Belt place, but had been thriving at one point. And at the time, by this time, I was learning how Appalachia could have an appetite for opiates. It seemed very strange to me that a place like Appalachia had any heroin at all, but then as I got into it, I realized the real story was prescription pain pills. And this all had to do, I began to learn, with a massive revolution in American medicine that began in the late 1980s. It began for good reason. There was a lot of good intentions, a lot of good reason. The guys who started it were younger doctors who had grown into medicine, you know, came to medicine with really good intentions of helping people, and they saw that up to that point, for many, many years, nobody would prescribe these pills for any reason whatsoever. People could be dying of horrible pain, terminal cancer patients, and doctors still would not prescribe them because it would risk getting them addicted. Well, these doctors made an argument: why do we care if they're addicted, if they only have 3 to 6 months to live or something like that? And they formed a kind of a collective conscience. They were all over the country, but they began to know each other at conferences, and they developed this idea that we needed really to be assuaging and alleviating people's pain, and we already had a tool to do that: opiate pain pills, and they were not being used sufficiently. They began to question why that was, and the truth is, they won that. They won that argument fairly quickly. Obviously, there was no good reason why people should be dying in such pain, and that pendulum, they didn't stop there was the thing. They began to say, no, we use all kinds of pain. Insurance companies began cutting back on other kinds of pain services, and that left doctors with one tool. There was an argument. They made an argument: we're in a country with an epidemic of pain that is not being treated. All across the country is untreated pain. They developed in a kind of an underground of pain specialists, and they developed almost like a revolutionary approach to this. They were revolutionaries, and like most revolutionaries, I think what happened was the ends justified the means. They began to make arguments they cannot support. One of them was, the main one was, that if science now knew that these pills were virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain. That is not true. Science does not know that, still doesn't know that, but they made that argument. They made another argument. Science now knows that less than 1% of all people get addicted when using these pills to treat pain. None of that was true, but they didn't care. In fact, later on, they recognized that their main spokesman recognized that they didn't have any evidence of what they were saying. They just were saying it to get people to get off away from the fear of using those pills, to liberalize more aggressively use these pills in medicine. It was almost as if a kind of a religious crusade developed around these pills. At the same time, though, across the country, we began, several other things were afoot. Medicine began to buy the idea that we're a country in pain, and they instituted this idea that pain was the fifth vital sign. Just like a pulse and respiratory and all that, you should test, doctors must test for pain. The problem is, pain is not a vital sign. You cannot test it every time and objectively the way you can with say, a pulse or something. At the same time, we had this idea grow up that pain is what the patient says it is. Now, that's a good idea, that doctors should listen to patients when they talk about their pain. The problem is, pain is what the patient says it is a slippery slope towards doctor shopping, and that's pretty much what began to happen as well. There was a patient rights movement that said the doctor always needed to listen to the patient. At the same time, they instituted patient evaluations, doctor evaluations of patients. Patient evaluations of doctors, pardon me. And this allowed doctors to, or had doctors exposed to the idea that they needed to satisfy their patients. And one way they satisfied their patients increasingly was by prescribing lots of these pills. And that's what the patients demanded. And if they didn't get what they demanded, they would write a bad evaluation for a doctor. There was also, I believe, a big movement towards fear of pain in this country. We began to fear pain. Nobody likes pain, but there was a true deep fear of it. And there was also an idea that doctors now needed to fix us, that we're kind of like cars, and doctors needed to fix us. By the way, we're not going to be a part of that. We were not going to be accountable to our own wellness. We wanted them to just take care of it quickly, please. In 1996, kind of the world changed, and I think the world here also changed dramatically, and that's when Purdue Pharma from Stamford, Connecticut, released OxyContin in January of 1996. I think they had data that showed that this whole area, doctors were already prescribing drugs for all kinds of things, that they were very, very aggressive already, and they targeted this area, believing this area to be an area of in pain where doctors were already ready to prescribe, that this was not something new, that they wouldn't have a whole lot of convincing to do. They used, for the first time, opiate painkillers were prescribed were marketed like over-the-counter medicine to doctors. They didn't market it to us. They had to convince doctors that these pills were non-addictive, and that's what they set out to do, with a bunch of studies that turned out not to be studies at all, a bunch of data that turned out to be kind of fudged a little bit, enough to convince doctors that this was not going to be a problem. And they also began to give away stuff, just like in any kind of, come on, you know. They gave away hats and trips to Scottsdale and trips to Florida for continuing medical education. They gave away, there was a CD that they gave out which was titled Swing in the Right Direction with OxyContin. And it had songs, you know, Woody Herman and Count Basie and the Andrews Sisters and all these old swing tunes. Excuse me. One of the early adopters was right here in Portsmouth, a guy named this fellow David Proctor. He also began prescribing very aggressively, not just OxyContin, but Xanax and OxyContin together, which is an extraordinarily addictive combination. But all across, he was not alone. Soon, all across the country, beginning in this area, though, beginning in the area, Columbus to the north, Cincinnati, West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, all that area, which Portsmouth was pretty much like the center. Doctors across this area began prescribing it very heavily, convinced by the pharmaceutical promotion. This was a time of the pharmaceutical sales force arms race. All the pharmaceutical companies across the country were hiring more and more and more salespeople, and doctors were tripping over each other in doctors' offices. In 1993 or 4, I think, there was about 35,000 pharmaceutical sales reps in the United States. By 2003 and 4, there was 120,000. Gives you an idea of the massive pharmaceutical promotional machine that went into force and hit this area first. Soon, doctors were prescribing it for all kinds of things, wisdom teeth extraction, bad backs. They were prescribing for routine surgery, but it wasn't just a few pills. It was 60 Vicodin. I had my appendix out in 2009, and I didn't know what a Vicodin was at that point. I hadn't begun this project. I had no clue. I'd been in Mexico when all this was going on. I didn't know what a Vicodin was. No one told me, and they gave me 60 Vicodin. The message in that bottle was, go ahead, you can do it. It's virtually non-addictive. We know, science now knows that it's all kind of non-addictive, so don't worry about it. So these opiate pain pills were prescribed over and over for all kinds of new things that had not been the case 10 years before, and they were prescribed in massive doses because doctors believed that there was no risk of addiction, and dosages could just keep going up and up and up on the same patient without any fear of anything going wrong. Pills then begin to slosh all over the country is what I found. One of the first places, again, was here. In Portsmouth became, I think, one of the extreme expression of that pain revolution that held, we're in a country in pain, and we need to very aggressively blast pain with these pills we know are now non-addictive, and that's pretty much what happened here. Proctor was the first. He was termed by one cop I read as the Ray Kroc of pill mills. His story was fascinating. I always thought he had this if you study his progression, he was probably in the 80s a doctor who was very conscientious, trying to find solutions for people in the middle of the economic destruction that was going on around here. He was trying to find solutions. That was in 1988 when the Kentucky Board of Medical Licensure first investigated him, and I read those reports, and you could see a doctor who was, I thought, honestly trying to find a different way besides pills, just trying to find a way to help his patients, and by 1998, it was all very, very scuzzy kind of extortion of sex from women who are very, very vulnerable. He had kind of, slid, and that's what happened with many doctors. As the opiate pain revolution spread across the country, more and more doctors saw the cash to be made by charging people $250 every appointment, every month that they had to come in to get their prescription. It was a kind of a weakening of the moral and ethical resolve of an industry. He began to train doctors at his clinic after he had a car accident, and they began to go out, and they saw the business model, and they began to go out all across this region. And finally, people here, local folks, began to see that Ohio law didn't require that required almost nothing. That almost anybody could run a pain clinic, even a felon. So they crept all over town, and an entire generation grew addicted. Meanwhile, I was coming to Portsmouth, and I began hanging out at that marvelous sober clubhouse that you all have on 52 out here. I met Marianne Henson, who was a former cheerleader, who had an amazing story to tell, but also very welcoming, very generous person who allowed me to just hang out. And I would get into conversations for hours at a time. I'd spend 4 or 5 hours at this clubhouse asking people about what pill mills meant, what pills and pill mills meant to a small town. It seemed to me, too, that they began to describe this OxyContin economy that grew up in this town, which seemed to me the most bizarre concept I think I'd heard in a long time. How pills became currency, how you could buy almost anything, T-bone steaks, dental service, cable TV service, refrigerators, cars, how pills, because they didn't dissolve very easily, were a currency, and they were marked. It was 10, 15, 40, 80, whatever it was, and they were backed. They held their value because they were backed by the central banks of the pill, which were the pill mills. They kept on pumping out this kind of pharmaceutical money supply. I began to ask people, and I could see the economic damage done to the town had left it without a diverse kind of economic ecosystem. Main Street was denuded. About the only place to buy things were Kroger's or Walmart. heard a bit of the economic history of the town from Jew Fight. We had a couple of conversations about this. He's a professor at the school here, talked about the jobs leaving, and the way I had it described to me was that a piece of a soul of the town was leaving also. Things began to leave, but at the same time, I heard this great other story. And that was how this hulking building that housed this amazing shoelace manufacturer, how they had saved that shoelace manufacturer from destruction, from bankruptcy, how they were going to ship all those jobs, whatever were left, out to Honduras, and that was going to be the end of it. To me, as I heard that story, I showed up at, I called Brian Davis, the manager of the operation, a couple of times. I think he was kind of confused, like, who the hell would this guy be? You know, some reporter from California whose last name I really cannot pronounce. And why would he want to talk about shoelaces? I'm not sure I even knew why I wanted to talk about shoelaces. I just thought it was an interesting story that they had saved. I thought the town was all about giving up and fatalism and letting those jobs go, because you know what? We're a financial services country right now, and all those jobs belong in Malaysia, isn't that right? And I saw the abandoned buildings, and I saw the fast food and the pawn shops and the hookers and all that, and I thought to myself, well, this is a town that seems to have given up. That was my first impression until I heard the story of Mitchell Lace, which is now called Soul Choice. I truthfully believe that I kind of started crying after I was listening to the tape of that story. I know my wife did. It was like, that is a beautiful story. It's a story of how they decided finally, you know, it was kind of like the opposite of the stories I was hearing about the pill mills. It was about a town taking action, not letting destruction happen, right? But saving itself. It was the first inkling that I had that my initial impression of Portsmouth might need revising, and it had nothing to do with heroin. But in time, I thought it did. I thought it did have to do with opiates. It had to do with a new way of thinking about the town, about whether or not we're just going to let this stuff happen to us, or whether we are going to take action. And a few business people who knew nothing about shoelaces pooled their money, bought that company out of bankruptcy, and it's functioning again. And last I heard, it was employing something on the order of 60, 80 people, exporting shoelaces to Taiwan and Mexico and Italy. Meanwhile, I was realizing some things about how this whole problem that began in the area where I was spending a lot of time, Columbus, down to here, of course, eastern Kentucky, et cetera, all those areas. But I was realizing then that this problem was spreading across the country, it was not just here. And the reason it was doing so, I thought, the fundamental reason was because people were remaining quiet, mainly parents were remaining quiet. Their kids had died. They were middle-class folks. They were folks who, maybe they were working class. Either way, the idea that they would let anybody else know that their son had died with a needle in his arm in a bathroom in McDonald's was just beyond the pale. So people would list, in an obituary, died suddenly, died of a heart attack. And this is why this spread. It's because nobody wanted to talk about it. The only people, we're in a time when we like to criticize government and talk about how bad, oh boy, government's so inefficient. I'm here to tell you that the only people who were fighting this scourge when nobody else would were government employees and people who were not very well known. Public health nurses, cops, prosecutors, jailers, county EMS, all those folks, they were getting nobody from the private sector. The private sector was on occasion threatening those people with lawsuits. This was the only people I realized early on that I was able to talk to were government employees. It was an amazing recognition that almost nobody else wanted to talk with the exception of a few private drug counselors, basically. Meanwhile, parents, as this one guy told me, parents all across America were remaining in their rooms, mortified, ashamed, crying their eyes out, their arms around a photo album, and terrified and humiliated and not doing anything in public. By the third visit, to Portsmouth, by now I was very well known to the folks at the clubhouse. I met Abby and Missy and a variety of folks, and people got used to me. That's a really good technique for a reporter. I lived for 2 months with an entire colony of Mexican drag queens, and after a while, I became part of the scenery. I became like a picture on the wall. No one paid a lick of attention to me, and that's when you see some really great stories, let me tell you. That's when you hear some amazing stuff, I'm not gonna lie. So by the third time, and I also believe in my reporting that immersion is essential. You have to immerse yourself in your topic and your place or your subject. If you don't, you'll miss an awful lot. By then, I was hearing about this glorious, beautiful football field-sized swimming pool. A place where everyone seemed to be equal. Everyone looked the same in swim trunks. It was the town's babysitter. It was cheap. Subscriptions to the pool were given away as Christmas presents. Everybody grew up. It was a town center. As you were a toddler, you grew up in the small end. I put a notice up on Facebook asking people for their recollections, and I got back 3 days worth. It just went on and on and on. Recollections of copper tone, of French fries, of I lost my virginity in the fields around Dreamland. You know, how many of you guys lost their virginity outside in the fields around Dreamland? Okay, you don't have to answer that. Those comments went on and on. It was a beautiful thing. My wife, she cries at Hallmark cards, so she cries over that too. But I learned that the demise of Dreamland was kind of part of the demise of the town as well. It seemed to me that once the town lost this life-giving force, the thing that brought people together in public, where kids grew up in public under the watchful eyes of hundreds of other parents. And as John Lorenz told me today, everyone behaved because everyone was terrified of getting kicked out for the summer. The worst punishment you could get is getting kicked out of Dreamland. Once you lost that, though, it was as if the town lost its kind of social immune system, right? It was the thing that protected it from these societal viruses. People went indoors. They stopped knowing each other, and thus they became easy prey for a virus like opiate painkillers, which came along, not coincidentally, only a few years later. But it seemed to me, too, and this is one reason I kept coming back, that the town story was the country's story as well. That as a nation, we had done a lot to lose community, and this had harmed us deeply. It was on, I think, that third trip that I also met Joanna Crone and heard her story. She was one of the few parents I knew who were actually talking about this problem and routinely, and going to schools and hospitals and various places, talking about what had happened and what was going to happen if we didn't do something more. It was one of the few people, as I said, I went across this country and I met 4 parents. 4 parents. How many people were dying during those years? Thousands. 4 parents that I met wanted to actually talk about this. It was during that visit that I heard for the first time the song "Arms of an Angel." What just a gorgeous tune. I never even heard of Sarah McLachlan before that, and now I've got it on iTunes, and I kind of want to when I get all weepy and want to have a good cry, I listen to that song. It became kind of, though it seemed to me, the soundtrack to several years in this town where you were burying kid after kid after kid, and that song was played at funeral after funeral. Meanwhile, I was hanging out persistently at that clubhouse, and I began to piece together the story of how stealing from Walmart and Walmart itself sustained the opiate epidemic. I mean, by that point, Main Street was gone. I have a theory that had there been all across this region a diverse economic ecosystem, a solid main street where there was store after store after store, locally owned by people who knew the community, that this problem would not have spread so quickly. But all the addicts knew. Once the OxyContin economy broke out, the pill economy where you could buy anything, Walmart was the fountain of all the stuff that you needed to steal. And of course, they pay their greeters $9 an hour. And as Nate Payton told me, no one is going to face off against a wide-eyed, desperate junkie, and least of all a 7-year-old woman getting paid $9 an hour. But my feeling is that had there been that diverse economic ecosystem, those merchants would have known who those addicts were, would have been prepared because they had an investment. They would have been prepared to defend their shops, and it would have been very difficult to make your daily nut. Not saying they wouldn't have done it, but it would have been a whole lot more difficult. Excuse me. But I think it was also, the same time I was hearing about Walmart, same time I was hearing about Dreamland, it was also on that third visit when I began to hear of a recovery community then emerging in town. Okay? I tell you what, folks, why don't we take like a little, like 10-minute break or something like that, and come back if that's okay with you guys, and I'll start up where I left off, if that's okay. Okay? All right then.